The selection and presentation of the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction is one of my favorite responsibilities as Librarian of Congress. The prize gives this great institution an opportunity to honor our nation's best novelists or short story writers for their enduring excellence, from their debut book to their most recent novels or short story collections. Past prize winners of the prize include such luminaries as E.L. Doctorow, Louise Erdrich, Toni Morrison, Philip Roth, and Annie Proulx. It is my distinct honor and pleasure to award the prize this year to one of our nation's most gifted writers, someone Time magazine has called America's storyteller. He is the youngest recipient of this Library of Congress award and one of only 4 writers in history to receive the Pulitzer Prize for Fiction twice. I'm talking about none other than Colson Whitehead, whose most recent novel, The Nickel Boys, won this year's Pulitzer, as did his 2016 novel, The Underground Railroad. Colson has an extraordinary ability to write about historical events and transform them into metaphors fraught with meaning and relevance for today. He is that rare writer of literary fiction whose works are also bestsellers, a testament to his talent for communicating to everyone who cares to listen. This award is the result of the recommendations from more than 60 literary peers, and I was happy to accept their choice. Colson Whitehead, please accept the 2020 Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction.
Yeah, wow. It's a real, big honor. I've been writing for 29 years now, first as a journalist at the Village Voice newspaper in New York, which closed down last year, and then as a novelist. And I've had many ups and downs. Sometimes you write a book and people sort of get it, and then sometimes they don't. And whenever things are going really badly, I would just say, keep going, Colson. Don't give up, or else you'll have to get a real job. And Lord knows you don't want to do that. So thank you, Library of Congress, for affirming my resolve not to get a real job. And I'll definitely think about this moment when I feel low in the future, when a book's not going that well. I know people are pulling for me. So thanks a lot.
Colson, a very big congratulations to you from the Library of Congress, which is where I'm sitting right now in the members' room in Washington, D.C. And we're going to talk a little bit about your career, and I should introduce myself to the good people out there. First, I'm Marie Arana, and I'm the literary director of the Library of Congress. And we are very, very proud to be giving this award to you, Colson. What an extraordinary series of achievements that you've made in such a short time. Really sort of since your first publication in 2000, it's been 20 years. And we are super impressed because you are the youngest person ever to receive this prize. And you're going to go on to do a lot more in your lifetime achievement. But just big huzzas from the Library of Congress to you.
Thanks.
So we want to take a little walk through your career, all 20 years of it. And we'll start really with a little background on you. You were born in Manhattan. You went to school in Manhattan. Then you went off to Harvard. And then you, as you mentioned, you started in journalism at the Village Voice. How did that, where did the writing bug bite you? When did that start?
Yeah, I was very young. As a kid, I didn't like to do sports or leave the house. And my perfect day when I was a little kid was staying home, reading comic books, Marvel comic books, watching Twilight Zone reruns, and reading Stephen King. Every year my mom would buy the new Stephen King novel, his great sort of late 70s, early 80s run, and we'd all trade around the house. And I thought when I was in 7th or 8th grade that writing the X-Men or Spider-Man would be a great job. Writing novels about vampires and robots would be very cool. I could work from home, not talk to people, and it seemed like an all-around good gig.
Well, you've talked about this, and you've said this very many times, so it's nothing new. But your first novel, your first attempt at a novel was, you call it a failure. You got rejected, and you went back to the drawing board again to sort of to do it better, to do it right. And what made you stick to it after that first rejection?
Yeah, I wanted to become a writer when I was younger. I wanted to write in college, but I really became a writer by being rejected and realizing that even if no one understood what I was doing, I had no choice but to keep going. And so that meant maybe this next book won't be published, but the next one after that, or the next one after that. And just in the act of writing these different things that people may like or may not like, I'll become a better writer. And so it was really just realizing that if I want to devote my life to this, I have to pick myself up and start and write a page, and then another page, and then it adds up if you keep doing it. And no one else is going to do it, so you might as well not waste any time.
Yeah, that's just a good lesson in general, isn't it? I mean, that the creative life doesn't always soar. Yeah. So it's a very good lesson, I think, for the rest of us. The first time we saw you, the first time that your public really knew who you were, and you made a pretty big mark with it, was your first book that was published, which was The Intuitionist. And it was compared to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. It was compared to Bernard Malamud. And I can actually see those comparisons because it was somewhat hallucinatory, as Ellison was in Invisible Man. And it was also funny and wry, like Malamud. So I see those comparisons. What do you think of when people make those comparisons of you? I mean, do you have those models? Were you an admirer of those particular authors?
Yeah, I mean, certainly Ralph Ellison. I remember reading the first chapter of Invisible Man in 7th grade. It was one of those books that collects short stories for elementary school kids. Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, and then inevitably The Lottery, and then Invisible Man's first chapter. And I remember just thinking, oh, here's this weird black guy, Ralph Ellison. I don't know what the story is about. It's crazy, but if he's doing it, maybe I could do it. I think because I learned, to love literature by reading fantastic literature, when there were absurd set pieces in Invisible Man, or when I encountered magic realism, Garcia Marquez, I saw how the fantastic could be a tool for talking about the realistic. And so I learned a lot from Ellison, and when people say, compare me to a very talented, lovely person, I'm always flattered. And if that's your frame of reference, I'll take it. I'm not going to write an angry letter to the editor.
Yeah. Well, you went on from The Intuitionist and making a very big splash with your first book to do John Henry Days, about John Henry and that extraordinary competition with the trains. Colossus of New York, X Hides the Hurt, Sag Harbor, Zone 1. I got to say, Colson, each one of your books, when I look at each one of your books, each one has been a new invention. You completely have, there is no genre of Colson Whitehead. There is no sort of formula here. I don't hear the same voice in every book. It's different. Do you mean that to happen?
It just sort of happened that way. I think partially, if I do a book that's very serious, maybe the next project be a little more funny, have more capacity for humor. A long book, maybe followed by a short book or a novel by a book of nonfiction. But I grew up loving David Bowie and Stanley Kubrick. And of course, there are artists who always changed it up from project to project. So Stanley Kubrick would do his war movie, science fiction movie, horror movie. just trying on these different genres. And if you can do something once, why do it again? It seemed. And David Bowie, in the 70s and 80s, would always change his persona from record to record. And it seemed like maybe that was a rule I internalized about being an artist. If you do something once, why would you want to do it again the next time? So with, say, Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys, they both deal with American history and institutional racism, but one uses fantasy, the Underground Railroad, and the other one is shorter and more realistic. And that sort of switching up is a way of keeping the work fresh for me. And maybe it disappoints some readers here and there, but maybe they'll come back with the next one after that.
I wouldn't say it disappoints any readers, but it puzzles the literary critics. I come from literary criticism, and you love nothing more. One loves nothing more as a critic than to be able to pigeonhole somebody, and we can't pigeonhole you. And I was imagining if somebody were trying to pigeonhole you, Colson, they would say, okay, boys, Sag Harbor, Nickel Boys, you don't get much farther than that. You can say trains, you can say John Henry, Underground Railroad, but you don't get much farther than that. So it's impressive, really, the invention, the imagination goes into different places with you every time.
Well, yeah, thanks. I mean, another thing is, like, I think New York City, my hometown, and the city as a figure is a bit in John Henry days, and my book of essays about New York, The Colossus of New York. It's in Zone 1, a sort of fantastic New York City after the apocalypse. And the book I've just finished writing takes place in Harlem in the 60s. And so I keep returning to my hometown, and hopefully I'm finding different ways of talking about it. Because again, if I found one way of doing something, what's the point of doing it again?
I want to talk about your hometown because, you come from a family that was into commerce and finance. Your parents were both business people, if I'm right about that.
Sure.
So that you're very attuned to the commercial world, and there are not many writers today novelists today who are talking about work, business, commerce. But I see it in your work, and there's a very strong sort of affinity and understanding of, the business at hand, the work out there, the city.
Yeah, I think it's the way we live. We're all sort of prey to late stage capitalism, and so definitely our roles in the machinery of business is important. The way we receive, consume, idealize consumer products is a recurring theme. I think you can't really talk about America unless you're talking about money, race, class. These things are entwined. And so, in a book where I'm taking a step back and trying to figure out how the world works, money is a big part of it, and class.
You mentioned race, and there's a constant awareness of race in all of your books. And it takes it almost in, I would say, in a Toni Morrison way or a Joseph Heller way. It takes race, it goes into the big picture. I mean, you can actually read your books as saying more about the big picture than what they're saying about the events on the page. Obviously, this is something that's very much on your mind. Is it something that's deliberate, or is it something that just is there, part of you, and the way that you speak and see the world?
Sure. I mean, my race, my Americanness, my New Yorkness, define how I view things. They're one of the many lenses through which I view the world, and they inform my work, definitely. I have some books where race is important, and some books where race is not important at all, like my book about New York, which
Right.
Has chapters about rush hour and Central Park, and it's not Black Central Park, or Black rush hour, it's just rush hour. But race does define so much of my experiences in life, and I'm glad that I can address it in this or that piece of fiction. And like the city, find different ways of talking about it. Race functions one way in Sag Harbor, which is about being a teenage black kid in the 1980s, differently than in Underground Railroad, which steps back to examine slavery and institutional racism and how an attitude towards blackness, white supremacy has defined our country. And so if I can find different ways of talking about race or history in the city, I think I'm doing my job.
Yeah, it's incredible to me because you then did, I mean, you talk about light, dark in your work, and you've actually described it as a jokey book, and then a serious book, and then a jokey book and a serious book. But these last two books of yours, they're both of them Pulitzer Prize winners, the Underground Railroad and Nickel Boys, take a deep dive into race and history. Very strongly so. And I wonder to what extent your journalistic background leads you in this direction. And is this something that, and in both books, well, not in both books, Nickel Boys, not at all, but in the Underground Railroad, you fuse history with fantasy in a way. And so it seems to me that you're being drawn into a historical mode in your latest two works. Is this now a passion of yours, or is it a phase, or how would you describe this history?
I guess for me, I find it useful. I think in Zone 1 and John Henry days, Apex Hides the Hurt, I was writing about contemporary society, and I think I've said my fill. I don't have that much new to say about how we live right now, but going to the past has provided a lot of material and forced me to think about how we got here in different ways. Coming to slavery as someone in their 40s, as opposed to a little kid seeing Roots or a college kid studying history, I understand slavery in a different way, in a more grown-up way. Researching the Jim Crow era and the Nickel Boys, I understand how the big laws restricting Black life and the smaller laws that provided daily humiliation for Black citizens, I understand them differently. And so I found more things to talk about by going to the past. The book I just finished takes place in Harlem in the 60s, and doesn't deal with institutional racism, deals more with class and money, it being New York City. I was forced to write about New York in a new way and research the city in this period just before I appear on the scene. I was born in '69. So what was New York like in the late 50s and early 60s? I don't know. And in doing research, I find a different way to talk about the city and a different way of viewing things. And it's been very useful for my work.
Absolutely. And so my question to you is, what do you do for relief, for fun? What do you like to read apart when you're working? Because as we all know, being a writer is living in a very deep rabbit hole, right? You're working in a solitary fashion. You are diving deep into what you're doing. Sometimes you're in a trance. And if you're in that zone, it's a good thing. But what do you do when you come out of that zone? Well, how do you have fun? What do you read? What interests you apart from writing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing that really interests me is cooking. I started cooking, when I got out of college, and a novel takes years. You make a meal, it's a couple hours, and you get to actually enjoy it, as opposed to a novel, which you can't really share with people until a lot of time has passed. And so, so that's good. To read, in these sort of hectic times with the pandemic and the daily onslaught of bad news in politics, my attention span is really short, so I can only really read journalism and then books for research. So I long for the day when there's less news to distract me, and a place where I'm not working on something. And I have a big stack of stuff I want to read. Britt Bennett has a new book called The Vanishing Half, and her first book, The Mothers, was great. It came out 4 years ago, and I met her. It was her debut, and it's nice to see the young folks continue to thrive. N.K. Jemisin writes science fiction and fantasy. I read her 5th season books, 2 years ago, and she's a new one called The City We Became. It's about New York through a fantastic lens, which overlaps with my concerns about the city, and also Zone 1 is a fantastic New York. So I'm excited to see how she does it. So unfortunately, all I can really do right now is read books for research, and right now that's sort of New York in the 70s for another book about New York. And I wish I had the attention span to read for fun, but perhaps one day.
Those are great works. Those are wonderful. And in fact, I should say, the Librarian of Congress always gives this prize during the National Book Festival. And so here we are in the middle of the National Book Festival, Colson. And the festival, and in fact, N.K. Jemisin is in this festival with her new book. So so that's a good thing. You've just given her a nice nod. Thank you.
Hopefully we're not appearing at the same time. So yeah.
Yeah. That's a pity. You would have had a great time at the gala party before the festival opened. But I want to say to you, the theme of this festival is American ingenuity. And we're meant to think about, for a moment perhaps, at least for the time that this festival is on stage and in view, in public view, of the sort of abiding good stuff that's deep down in the creative world, in the world of ingenious people like you who bring us these tremendously wonderful and nourishing adventures and stories. So the theme, though, is American ingenuity. And what exactly would you say, Colson, ingenuity is to you? And how do you see ingenuity, and particularly American ingenuity, if we have that?
Well, given what I've worked on for the last 6 years, those 2 books, I would say it's survival. A slave escaping north, a slave surviving and protecting their child, so their child can perhaps be born to a better world, and in that generation or generations after that, be free, enjoy freedom. And then I've been reading a lot about New York in the 70s, and again, survival comes up. I think after this pandemic subsides and recedes, New York and the rest of the country will need a lot of TLC. I think New York always bounces back. I'm reading a book about the arts in New York, the birth in the 1970s. The cities in the 70s, New York City in the 70s was in a terrible place. It was broke, dirty, everyone angry. And there were artists inventing hip hop, artists inventing punk, inventing a new form of jazz, New York salsa. So in the ruins of this very dilapidated New York City, you have artists coming together to make these really vital songs and new forms of music that didn't exist. So, and that's survival, transcending your environment to make something new and pass something on. So those are my 2 thoughts.
That's a great thought. And I think that survival and maybe resilience too, and I see those last 2 books of yours, and where there are very, very high stakes and violence all around, and that sense of resilience and survival is so strong there. It's important to be aware of history, and it's important for us now to go back and to review the history of Black Americans and to look it in the eye and to teach it in the classroom. Why is it important to you, Colson?
I guess the typical answer is that we don't repeat our mistakes. I think in this case, it's to see how much we've yet to do in terms of repairing the fundamental flaws in terms of race, whether you're talking about Black folks or Native Americans. When the Underground Railroad came out, people would say, our original sin is slavery. I think original sin is the disposition and genocide of Native Americans. And so I don't think that's taught very thoroughly in schools. Slavery and the civil rights movement, not told very thoroughly. I think better since when I was a kid, but not as deeply as it should be. And if we don't know where we screwed up and what we still have to fix, you can't fix it. So
I was really impressed when I heard you say the other day, some time ago, that you use primary sources. And that's very important to you because I'm assuming that you're going back and looking at slave narratives and you're looking at actual source material like that. That is material that comes from memory. It's not historians writing it and perhaps imposing their point of view. It's the people themselves. Why is memory, perhaps, in that kind of narrative, just as important as the evaluated, considered, examined history?
well, I mean, there's so much that in, say, Underground and Nickel Boys that lives because it's stuff that wouldn't exist in a historian's account. It's slang, it's nouns and verbs that escape the official narratives. And so when I was going to slave narratives and then the oral histories collected by the US government in the 1930s, they were trying to put writers back to work and have them interview former slaves. All that language, when they talk about what they wore, how they planted, this dead language we don't use anymore is living in their first person accounts. And so it's invaluable to a fiction writer, but a historian would never think to preserve. It's what makes, I think, those last two stories definitely sing. And without those first person accounts, we lose so much of how we used to live and how people used to dream.
Were you a student of history back in Harvard when you were there?
No, I mean, I really, I was an English major and the department was very conservative. There was one class, I think, that taught the American novel after 1945, and it was great stuff. It was Toni Morrison and Ralph Ellison. So I finally got to read Invisible Man, not just the first section. But that means I had to sort of hunt around. And so I took classes in the African American Studies program, in the theater program. I wasn't an actor, but I studied drama, I studied plays, and some literature classes, writers in foreign languages that wouldn't be taught in the English department. And so I think I became more of a student of history by trying to make my stories actually live. It's one thing to say, here's a kooky idea, the Underground Railroad's a real railroad. Even if I'm not going to stick to reality, how did the Underground Railroad work? And then how did slavery work? How do I make this fantastic story real? And that led me to study history. There are certain books I've written where, say, Sag Harbor, which was just listening to 80s hip hop and new wave music, Susie and the Banshees and Bauhaus. And then there are books that require a different kind of research. And it's definitely nice to mix them up.
So I'm sitting in the Library of Congress, right? And right upstairs is Thomas Jefferson's collection, his original collection, which was actually the foundation of the Library of Congress. When the library burned down in 1812, during the 1812 British attack on Washington, Jefferson actually said, okay, all those books burned down, now you can buy mine. And there were, thousands of books that came from the Jefferson collection, and they're here, they're sitting here. And the way that he organized his library was the way that Francis Bacon organized his library, which was memory, reason, and then the imagination. So memory would be history, reason would be philosophy, science, and imagination would be fiction. And where do you fit if you were to be put in one of those categories, or do you straddle all three?
I'm not sure. It's really for other people to situate or not situate my books. Apparently, billions of people in the world live full and happy lives without ever thinking about my books.
Librarians, right?
and where they should go. So I'm happy they exist at all. And we were talking earlier about switching genres, and I'm just so happy that the books are out there, and someone can pick up Sag Harbor and think, oh, he's a writer of humor, and someone could pick up Underground Railroad and say, oh, he's a historical novelist, or my book about the World Series of Poker and say he's a nonfiction writer who makes a lot of weird jokes. And so I don't think too much about how to classify these things. For me, it's all just work, a good, fun kind of work, not difficult work. I mean, it's hard, but and so yeah, I think I'll leave it to other people. And for me, just be glad that it's even an issue to talk about.
Well, I think somehow you absorb all three of those things, and you do it beautifully. You do straddle. We are living, Colson, in these very uncertain times right now. We have a lot of issues to resolve. We have a country that is obviously in flux and in pain to some degree. And this uncertainty, this unrest, this feeling of unrest, what would you say to the people out there who are listening to you now about this? What is your message to perhaps the young or just the ordinary people who would value your wisdom right now?
Yeah, I think it's a ways to talk to people my age and older and a bit younger. So I think anyone under 20 who wants a piece of advice, I would say, don't do what we did. We left a lot of messes and problems for you. You're still young. Maybe you're not stuck in your ways. You can fix everything we screwed up. You basically have no choice if you want to live in a planet that's not 120 degrees every day. So good luck. Don't do what we did. And that's not very cheerful, and I apologize. But that's the way I see it.
Very, very nicely put. Colson, big congratulations on the Library of Congress Prize for American Fiction. We are so delighted to be giving this prize to you, and it's such an honor to talk to you just now.
And I'm delighted as well. Thanks so much, and stay safe. And I hope to see you guys in person a little, not too far from now.
Absolutely. Thank you, Colson.